Hello, this is Dr. Robert Guthrie. We're back with our Sunday school lesson from the Jerome United Methodist Church here in Dublin, Ohio. As you know, if you've been listening in, we've been doing this online YouTube version because we can't have Sunday school class in the church. And we've been working our way through the New Testament. We're now beginning the first 6 chapters of the Gospel of Luke. And we'll do Luke in 4 sections. And then we have 3 more lessons in John, because the first one we did was the last part of the Gospel of John, and that'll give us the whole New Testament covered, and you all can go through it at your leisure. So the first 6 chapters, and begin to make a little point at the beginning. There's in what are called the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. There's a lot of similar material, but you do find different emphasis, different tones, different areas of importance between the various gospel writers. In Matthew, there was very much the emphasis on Jesus as the fulfillment of the law. It was a very Jewish gospel written as the fulfillment of the Jewish Messiah. And there was a lot of anger in Matthew because many Jews rejected Jesus. Luke is very different. Luke was a Gentile. As far as we can tell, he was a physician. That's what the report is. Remember, physicians in that era were not nearly as prominent people in society as physicians are now. And he was a native Greek speaker. He was a companion of Paul. He was the author of Luke and Acts. The exact timing is not clear. Most of the scholars think it was written about the same time as Matthew, about 80 or 85 AD. Like I said, he had been a companion of Paul on some of the missionary journeys. Remember, when you do Acts, it will say, he did this, we did this, we did this, we did this, as he switches into the plural of the first person when he was accompanying Paul. And he starts off with a comment that he's expressing this to Theophilus, as he did in Acts, that so-and-so to Theophilus, I'm writing this, etc., as a companion. It's an interesting question. Does anybody have any idea who Theophilus was? No, I don't. And it was clearly someone with whom he was familiar, maybe even friends. If you look it up on the internet, there'll be about 5 or 6 different hypotheses as to who this person was. Each group that has a hypothesis, which is a scientific term for a guess, let's be very clear here, that it was someone from their similar background. So I have no idea. Does it really matter that we don't know? No, it really doesn't matter. Then you get into it, you'll see there's a different orientation than the legalism of Matthew. It's much more of an orientation on social justice. He's very harsh in his criticism of the wealthy and powerful taking advantage of their positions to abuse the people down below. So he's very much into that, and I'm very comfortable with that approach. But that's, as you read this, as compared to the anger that we saw in the chapters 21 through 23 of Matthew, you don't get that. So very much about social justice, very much about avoiding love of money, then he did say in this write-up that he went and talked to people who saw these events. So he claims first-person sources. It's not clear who they were or when he talked to them. Did he talk to? It implies he talked to Mary. Now, Mary would have been very young when Jesus was born, 14 or 15. And so she could have, if she lived into her 70s or 80s, lived long enough to meet Paul. Jesus was probably crucified in 32 to 33. And the missionary journeys with Paul went from 50 to 64. So it's possible that he met her. Or he could have talked to people who knew her, to her other children, et cetera, et cetera. And it starts off with an unusual opening that's unique to Luke. There is a priest named Zechariah who has a wife, Elizabeth, and she was, quote, barren, unquote. They always blamed infertility on the woman. Of course, it's a much more chauvinistic society, and some infertility is the female, and a lot of times it's the males, but it doesn't matter. And Zechariah's in the altar room by himself doing the rituals, and an angel appears to him. This angel is not named at this time, and he's a little bit shocked, and they tell him he's going to have a child, a son, and they're to name him John, and this will be the Lord's anointed. And they were to dedicate him to the Lord. And Zechariah is kind of argues with him. Oh, here's my cat joining us. Hello there. So he's made incapable of speaking because he doubts that the Lord can take this infertile wife and make her fertile. The Lord can do anything. So, but that's a good lesson. It's an interesting name. If you've ever known Indian Christians, there's about 3% of India are Christians, and a number of them in the southeast are called the Martha Wow, the St. Thomas Christians. Many of them have the name Zechariah or Zechariah, other variations off of that. They have drawn their names from the New Testament. So if you ever run into someone from India with a name like that, ask him if he's a Martha Wow. That means a St. Thomas Christian. The legend is that the Indian church was started by St. Thomas. Probably wasn't, but it's a good legend. But it's an interesting name that you may come across in history as you meet other people. So he comes out of the sanctuary, and he can't speak, and they're all shocked, and they realize he'd had some kind of a vision, apparition to him. And he goes home to his wife, and he still can't speak, and she becomes pregnant. And she proceeds through her pregnancy. During this time when she's pregnant, the angel Gabriel appears to Mary in Nazareth, which is the Annunciation, is what it's called, and tells her that she's going to be pregnant by the Holy Spirit, a divine conception, not a human conception, a divine conception, and she's going to have a child who will be the Lord's anointed, and she will name him Jesus, and also that her cousin Elizabeth was Mary's cousin, is also pregnant and going to deliver in the next few months. So it's a very interesting story. It's totally unique to Luke. So after this visit, now this angel is called, when the angel that visits Mary is called Gabriel. When you look at the history of angels named in the New Testament, there's only 3. You've got Gabriel, who's mentioned here. You've got Michael, who's called an archangel, who's mentioned in Jude and in Revelation. And then you have Raphael, who's mentioned in Tobit. Tobit is one of the apocryphal books, which is in the Catholic Bible. I use the Catholic Bible, but not in the Protestant Bibles. Luther dropped him out when he made his translations. So those are the only 3. There's a book called Enoch, which is not in the Old Testament or the New Testament, that lists 7 angels. This is a thing of historical interest, but it's really not of anything major theological. But in here, in Luke, they name the angel Gabriel. So Mary is told by the angel, and she goes to visit Elizabeth, her cousin, to help her through her pregnancy because she's an older woman. And when Mary arrives, the baby in the womb, I'm trying to think of the right way to put it in common English, knows that Jesus is there, and he begins to kick in the womb. And excitement to be near the Lord. And then after she delivers, Mary goes home to Nazareth. Now, Mary is betrothed to Joseph. Now, betrothal is not a contractual arrangement here in the United States, never has been. But in ancient times and in medieval times and before that, in certain cultures, not particularly in the British culture, it was an actual contract. You made a deal, and you didn't break this without some kind of legal ramification. So she was betrothed to Joseph, but they don't make as much of a deal about it in Luke as they did in Matthew. And then they, because Joseph is of the house of David, when they're going to have a census, he takes his family to Bethlehem, which is where his ancestry is from. David, of course, was born in Bethlehem. When they get there, the original translation was no room at the inn. Modern translation doesn't translate that word inn. Modern translation says there's no room in the dwelling, as if he had actually gone back to some relative's house and was going to stay there with them. And that would be more typical of the family relations. Family relations in this part of the world at this time were actually very close. You took care of your family, even if it was more the clan, your cousins and second cousins, third cousins, and all that. You took care of each other. So he was probably staying with family. and it was crowded, and so they were in the area for the animals. Now, is it unusual for people to sleep with the animals? No, particularly in wintertime. They had no heat. And if it's a cold night and you slept in a room with several animals, their body heat and your body heat kept each other warm. So the baby's born at night, which is very typical. Many babies are born at night. And in the translation says manger, they put him in, which implies they lower down in our nativity sets. It's an independent feeding area setting on the floor. Other people argue that really that's not what the word means. Remember, these are 2,000-year-old words. You really don't know exactly what they meant 2,000 years ago. Word meanings change over 30 to 50 years. 2,000 years is a long time. One person has argued that really is referring to a feeding area attached to the wall. So he would be up off the floor. If you had horses or animals like that, they're often fed where the hay is put about 3 or 4 feet up, and they can eat it at their head height rather than get down on the dirty floor. So it was probably attached to the wall, and he was up away from the floor that way. So it'd be more of a feeding trough rather than a manger. But this is hung up in the translations. And then the angels appear to the shepherds. The shepherds come and worship the child, and it proceeds on from there. He's circumcised at the 8th day, which is the custom then, and I think the custom still now for Jewish boys. And then when they bring him later to the temple in Jerusalem. Remember, Bethlehem's only about 5 or 6 miles from Jerusalem, so it's an easy walk. It takes an hour or more to walk it. And they present him to the Lord. They make a sacrifice. There's 2 very interesting stories that are unique to Luke's account, because Luke has a much more of a childhood-oriented account than any of the other Gospels do. John doesn't have one at all, and Mark doesn't have one at all. Matthew has the wise men and then adulthood. So you have this description of a man named Simeon, who's an older man who had been promised by the Lord that he would live long enough to see the Messiah, and he sees Jesus and recognizes that that's what he is, and does a prophecy about this. And then there's another prophetess called Anna, who also prophesies about the great things that this child is going to do. And then the family relocates back to Nazareth. It's not clear when, how long the time frame there was, but they do. And Nazareth at this time was a satellite village to a large Jewish community called Sepphoris. And Sepphoris has a very active commercial at the time. There's nothing there now. It's being archaeologically excavated. But people who would work in something like the building trade, which is probably what Joseph worked in, and maybe Jesus with him as he matured, would live a few miles away in Nazareth and then walk into work in the morning. And there's an account that they come back to Jerusalem each Passover, which is the big springtime festival, to celebrate the Passover. And it's about a 64-mile walk from Nazareth to Jerusalem. So it's about a 3-day walk, particularly if you're in decent shape, as these people probably were, because they had to walk everywhere. They didn't have cars, bicycles, any of the things we have. They had to walk everywhere. So it was a 3-day walk. And there's the story of when they go and Jesus is 12. Now, this is an interesting age, because in the Hebrew world at that time, as you start to develop secondary sexual characteristics, hair under the arms and things like that, then you become an adult. So Jesus was right on the verge of adulthood, and he stays behind. They walk a day north. They expect that he's with his cousin somewhere in the group. I'm certain the clans went by walked together and slept together on the road and stuff. And they look for him, don't find him. They turn around and go back to Jerusalem, and he's there talking to the scribes and the teachers of the law, and they're amazed by how much he knows. But this, again, is the beginning of his adulthood, as he goes into becomes the age of 12 and heads into what is the Jewish adulthood. A few years later, John Baptist begins his ministry, which is about 29 AD, dating it from what's written in the gospel. I don't remember the exact details. He gives the time, such and such year of such and such emperor, and that comes out to about 29 AD. John is a charismatic pastor. He lives rough. He wears animal skins. He eats wild honey and sleeps out in the woods. and does not drink any kind of spirits, wine at all, wine or alcohol or anything like that. And he proclaims that he is the messenger for the Messiah. He's not the Messiah. John makes no claim of that. And he's the messenger of the Messiah to prepare the way of the Lord. And he baptizes people in the Jordan River. There are traditional sites where he did this. No one knows if that's the actual case or not. I've not been down into the Jordan. It's fairly down below the land level. And he does baptize Jesus, which doesn't get much of a mention here in Luke as it did much more in Mark and somewhat more in Matthew. And again, you have the very thing about the heavens opening and the dove descending, but it's much briefer account. I think Luke is beginning to understand it was not that important to take this divine person, combination of divine and human, and have this baptism as a major part of his emergence into his own ministry. And then John gets locked up by Herod Agrippa. Now, this is the son of the Herod the Great who slaughtered the innocents trying to kill Jesus back when Jesus was born. Herod Agrippa is one of his sons. King Herod the Great actually killed off several of his sons. He was a ruthless, nasty man. The Romans used to joke it was better to be Herod's pig than Herod's kin because he wouldn't eat pork, trying to be a good Jew, but he killed off a lot of his family. You remember, if you're a brutal king, your major threats are your relatives, your brother or your sons, or your generals. And so he killed off a number of his sons. He didn't kill this one. He became the tetrarch, which was the client king of Galilee, not the area around Jerusalem, which is Judea. That was ruled directly by the Romans, but he had the area to the north. His brother had the area, different brother Philip, across the river into what's now Jordan. And John gets on his bad list because Herod Agrippa marries his brother's wife while his brother's still alive. This is really sinful behavior in Jewish law. And John just criticizes it. And Herod throws him in jail. Doesn't know what to do with him. He's afraid of killing him, that he'll upset the people too much because they really think he's a prophet, but he doesn't want this guy going around critiquing him. There was no such thing as free speech in that era. And he later gets beheaded at the request of the daughter of his new wife, who just does a dance and asks for John the Baptist's head on a dish. So that happens. Then Jesus is informed of this, and he goes through an episode after his baptism where he's tempted by, quote, the devil. Doesn't name the devil in Luke. His name's Satan in one of the synoptic gospels, but it doesn't deal with it. And it's the 4th chapter, and I've never understood the point of this narrative as to what this is. Why could the devil tempt the Lord? It doesn't make any sense to me, and if you want to send me an email and tell me why it makes sense, I'm more than happy to learn it. But it's in there, and I think I need to report on it. And he begins his ministry shortly thereafter, apparently in Capernaum, because the account doesn't follow a clear chronological order. It talks about him beginning a ministry in Nazareth, going to the synagogue on the Sabbath, reading from the scrolls, which pronounces the new messenger, and announces that he is one, and he's the new messenger. Well, they go ape, and they say, who is this guy? This is Joseph's son. We know him. He's nothing. This is where the line, the prophet has no honor in his own country, comes from. And they're going to take him and throw him off the cliff for being blasphemous to claim divine authority. And he just has such power that he can walk through the crowd, walk away from them, and escape. And then he goes on back to Capernaum and begins his ministry there. Now, Capernaum is on the northwest corner, upper left of the Sea of Galilee. Nazareth is to the east and northeast, east-northeast of the Galilee, toward the Jordan River. So they're not far away, but they're distinct communities. So he starts his ministry there. He heals a person that has a demon. He cures Simon Peter's mother-in-law. Again, as I said before, when we dealt with this, it means Peter had a wife, because you can't have a mother-in-law without having a wife. And there's no other mention of her except of that in the healing. And he begins to call the apostles. Simon and his brother Andrew are sitting in the lake by the boats. They've been fishing all day and not doing well, and Jesus tells him to cast his net out on the other side. And he said, well, I've been doing this and it hasn't worked. He said, we'll do it. So he does it, and it's so full of fish that the net begins to tear, and he's got to call his friends in the area to come help them get the net out and make all this long haul of fish. So he realizes Jesus' power, and he and his brother Andrew, along with James and John, the sons of Zebedee, join Jesus as the first apostles. It's very clear when you read this in continuity, because later Peter goes back and fishes, comes back to Jesus, goes back and forth. His family must have run the business. And I bet James and John's father, Zebedee, ran their business. So the sons could drop in and out and follow Jesus and go back and fish if they needed to. So these were probably family-owned boats, and they would pass it down from father to son. Then so he's called those four. He cures a person with a major skin disease, probably eczema or psoriasis, we don't really know. Then there's the story that's the favorite of some people I know, who about the paralytic, that he's healing people, and the crowd is around him is large, and the people have someone who's paralyzed on a bed or a stretcher, we don't really know, and they can't get him through the crowd, so they go up on the roof of the house. These are usually one-story houses, and they take the roof tiles off and they lower the person down below for Jesus to heal. And there's a dialogue, because he's going to tell them, get up, your sins are forgiven. And the Pharisees get all upset. This is blasphemous. How can you forgive sins? Only God can forgive sins. And he said, do you want me to say your sins are forgiven, or get up and walk? Because he doesn't have as much patience with them, because they don't have any patience with him. And so he heals the man. And it's a very interesting story of lowering him down through the roof. It's not my favorite story. My favorite story is the woman with the hemorrhage touching his cloak and being healed. But I do know people that value this one greatly, and it's a great story. And then he calls a tax collector to join him, Levi in this gospel, Matthew in the Gospel of Matthew. And Levi has them for dinner with a bunch of other tax collectors, and the Pharisees are all upset that he's eating with sinners. I laugh at this one, because every meal I've ever been in, even when I was eating alone, had a sinner in it, me, and other sinners that were there with me, because everybody's a sinner. And I laugh at this one because the Pharisees act like they're not sinners, when they're actually very critical of people and very judgmental of people, and don't share love of their brethren. They love their own power and prestige, which is a curse that church people can have even in this current time. So I always smile at that one, because there's always sinners around. Then they have the episode where they're picking corn on the Sabbath. Exactly what it was, I don't really know, because our modern corn comes from Mexico about 1000 AD. The Aztecs developed it. So exactly what kind of grain it was, I don't really know. But and it's a very good, interesting example, because and then he's in the synagogue, and there's a man with a withered hand, and they're trying to see if Jesus is going to heal this man with a withered hand on the Sabbath, because they worship the law, not the Lord. They worship the rules and applying the rules strictly. And Jesus knows that they're trying to trap him. Having worked as a physician on the Sabbath many, many times, Christmas, Sabbath, other holidays, you just do it. I don't have any hesitation about healing people on the Sabbath. But you got to be careful, even in our time, not to worship the law, not to worship the rules, but to worship the intent of the rules, which is that we love each other and take care of each other. And so he just has him hold his hand out, and it heals itself by his power to do it without even touching him. Then from there he goes to the Sermon on the Plain. Now the Sermon on the Plain is Luke's version of what's in the Sermon on the Mount. In Matthew, as you remember, we talked about in the classic Jewish stories, the encounters with the Lord were always on the mountain. Moses at Mount Sinai, Elijah at Mount Horeb. The sermon was on the mount in Matthew. It's on the plain here in Luke. He has 4 Beatitudes, not the 8 that he has in Matthew's account. He has 4 curses, and the curses are really on the rich and selfish, which is a particular issue in Luke's gospel. Excuse me a second. And you'll find this all the way through his gospel, critiquing the rich and selfish. It's a legitimate criticism then because, excuse me, in those days you had only the wealthy, everybody at the bottom. You didn't have people in the middle like we do now. But we have problems with the rich and selfish now everywhere in the world. So there's nothing unique about it then. It continues with us all the time. He stresses in this Sermon on the Plain to love your enemies. This is not just loving your friends. It's easy to like your friends. He's talking about loving people that are your enemies, that you don't like, that are dangerous to you, and you got to love them. And it's an interesting thing because a lot of the people who've been my enemies in life, if you step back from it and get more on the passion, many of those are unpleasant, unhappy, miserable people, which is why they're so difficult. So I actually can feel sorry for them. He said, if they strike you on one cheek, turn the other cheek to them. Then there's an interesting condemnation of lending money at interest. This became a bit of a problem. You know, it's not completely forbidden in the Old Testament, but high rates of interest were forbidden. And there's actually reference in the story of the talents, you know, the guy who had 5 talents and the one who had 2 and the one who had 1, and the one who just had 1 buried it, and the Lord said to him, why don't you just go give it to the bankers and get interest? So they were loaning it for interest even then. But there's a condemnation here against loaning at interest. The Catholic Church in the medieval and earlier times took this literally. So the Christians were not allowed to lend at interest through the Middle Ages in Europe. It had an odd side effect because who was going to become, you had to have people that loan you money. If you're going to start a business or buy a farm or all these other things, who's going to loan you money? The Jews did. So it enriched certain of the Jewish families in Europe, like the Rothschilds, because they became the bankers they could take people's money and loan it out and charge interest because they weren't Christian. It didn't bother. So that's faded away. And now usury, which was the term in those days, is considered loaning money at exorbitant amounts of interest. You can argue whether we're doing that now with the credit card debt and all that. But it had the side effect of the Jewish families, certain Jewish families in Europe become very, very wealthy. He's very clear on do not judge others unless you want to be judged. This is really, really important because I know many people are so critical of other people. You could step back and think, wait a minute, look in the mirror. How are you doing here? And the analogy is don't look at the splinter in your neighbor's eye when you've got a log or plank, it depends on the translation, in your own eye. Very good advice. Don't go criticizing people because you can be criticized too. And he wraps up with a description of a true disciple builds his house on a solid stone foundation rather than on a loose soil foundation. Because if you're on a loose soil foundation, when the rains come and the storms, it can wash your foundation away and your house will collapse. And if you've built your faith on the solid foundation of true love of the Lord and love of your neighbor, not just toleration of your neighbor, but love of your neighbor, being generous and kind and loving and nurturing to them and not judgmental, then your faith will survive these various storms. So this gives you a different impression of Luke's approach to the Beatitudes, and the sermon is to make them much more about how we deal with our fellow man, in addition as to how we deal with our relationship with the Lord, turn the other cheek, love them in spite of themselves, and build our house on a solid foundation. Now that finishes here. We're going to stop here. We'll do 3 more lessons on Luke. We'll be back in a week, and we'll do the next 6 chapters, which will be 7 through 12. This is Dr. Guthrie.